The massive transport ship hummed through space as it approached Kilos Prime, a frozen moon that looked like a giant ice ball floating in the darkness. Inside the ship, 24 students from across the galaxy sat in their seats, each one representing the best their species had to offer. This wasn't just any school trip. This was the Galactic Academy's most feared survival course, the one that separated the truly elite from the wannabes. The reptilian students from HFY Prime sat together, their scaled skin gleaming under the ship's lights. They kept bragging about their heat vision, how they could see warm spots even in complete darkness. One of them, a particularly arrogant student named Vorthak, kept flexing his claws and talking about how his people had survived on desert worlds for thousands of years. The cold would be nothing to them, he claimed. Nearby, the Melkit students were having their own conversation. These amphibious beings looked like a cross between frogs and humans, with smooth, wet skin that constantly changed color. They were excited about their ability to alter their blood chemistry, making their bodies adapt to almost any environment. One female Melkit named Zalara was already practicing, her skin shifting from blue to green as she controlled her internal temperature. The most impressive group, at least technology-wise, were the Vextai. These crystalline beings looked like walking diamonds, their bodies made of living crystal that sparkled with internal light. They didn't need to brag. Everyone knew they could process environmental data faster than any computer. They could calculate wind speeds, temperature changes, and survival probabilities in seconds. The other students looked at them with a mixture of respect and fear. Then there was Jake Morrison, sitting alone in the back corner of the transport. The human looked incredibly ordinary compared to his exotic classmates. No scales, no color-changing skin, no crystal body that could compute complex equations. Just a regular guy with brown hair and tired eyes, wearing the same standard academy uniform as everyone else. The other students barely acknowledged his existence, and when they did, it was usually with poorly hidden smirks or outright dismissive comments. During the briefing, Professor Keltar, a tall insectoid being with multiple arms, explained the rules. The survival exercise was designed to test their natural abilities under extreme conditions. They would be dropped on different parts of Kilos Prime's largest continent, each student getting basic survival gear, a knife, some rope, a water container, and an environmental suit that would protect them from the worst of the cold. The temperature on Kilos Prime dropped to minus 40 degrees during the day and got much worse at night. The exercise would last exactly 72 hours. Students needed to find shelter, locate food sources, and stay alive until pickup. Emergency beacons were built into their suits, and rescue teams would respond within minutes if activated. The professor emphasized that while the exercise was challenging, it was completely safe. In 50 years of running this program, no student had ever died. Jake listened carefully while his classmates chatted confidently about their plans. The reptilians talked about using their heat vision to find the warmest spots. The Melkods discussed adjusting their metabolism to conserve energy. The Vextai were already running calculations about optimal shelter locations based on wind patterns and thermodynamics. But Jake noticed something the others missed. As they approached Kilos Prime, his tablet showed unusual electromagnetic readings in the planet's atmosphere. The numbers kept fluctuating wildly, jumping up and down in patterns that didn't make sense. Jake had studied electromagnetic interference during his basic electronics courses back on Earth, and these readings looked dangerous. They looked like the kind of interference that could knock out electronic systems. He tried to bring this up to Professor Keltar, but the insectoid being dismissed as concerns. Human technology understanding is limited, the professor said with barely concealed condescension. Our systems are far more advanced and protected. As the transport began its descent toward the frozen surface, Jake couldn't shake his worry. While his classmates continued their confident chatter about biological advantages and natural abilities, Jake started thinking about much more basic things. He remembered camping trips with his grandfather, stories about ancient humans surviving ice ages with nothing but fire and cleverness. He thought about the pile of broken equipment and natural debris he'd seen in the satellite photos of their landing zone. While everyone else prepared to use their alien advantages, Jake Morrison prepared to become very human indeed. The first 6 hours on Kilos Prime went exactly as everyone expected. The alien students spread out across the frozen wasteland, each group confident in their natural abilities. The environmental suits kept them warm and comfortable while they explored their surroundings and set up basic camps. Communication systems worked perfectly, allowing students to check in with each other and the orbiting command ship. Jake had found a spot near some scattered wreckage from an old mining operation. While other students were busy showing off their abilities, he spent his time collecting things that seemed completely useless to everyone else. Broken metal pieces, dry plant matter that had somehow survived in the harsh environment, and chunks of what looked like ancient wood from long-dead trees. His classmates who passed by his area laughed at the primitive human gathering trash, while they used their superior biology to scout the perfect locations. Then the sky exploded with light. Solar flares erupted across the Kilo system, painting the frozen horizon in sheets of green and orange energy. The electromagnetic storm hit, like an invisible tsunami, washing over the moon's surface with devastating power. In seconds, every piece of advanced technology on the planet died. Environmental suits shut down completely. The heating systems that had been keeping students alive simply stopped working. Communication devices went silent. Most terrifying of all, the emergency beacons that were supposed to call for rescue became useless chunks of dead metal and plastic. The storm created such powerful interference that even the command ship orbiting above lost all contact with the surface. The temperature began dropping immediately. Without their heated suits, the students found themselves facing the true brutality of Kilo's prime climate. The daytime temperature of minus 40 degrees felt like a warm day compared to what was coming. As the planet's weak sun began to set, the mercury plummeted toward minus 60 degrees and kept falling. Panic spread faster than the cold. The Melkit students tried desperately to use their blood chemistry abilities to warm themselves, but their amphibious biology worked against them. The chemical processes that let them adapt to different environments required specific temperature ranges to function. As the cold deepened, their internal systems began shutting down one by one. Their color-changing skin turned a sickly gray as their bodies went into emergency conservation mode. The Vextai crystalline beings faced an even worse fate. Their living crystal bodies contained trace amounts of moisture that had never been a problem in controlled environments. But as the temperature dropped below their tolerance levels, that moisture began to freeze and expand. Hairline cracks appeared across their surfaces, spreading like spider webs through their crystalline forms. Each crack compromised their ability to process information, turning their computer-like minds into confused, panicking fragments of their former selves. Even the hardy Thekvar reptilians, who had boasted about surviving on desert worlds, found their cold-blooded metabolism betraying them. Their heat vision became useless, as everything around them turned the same deadly shade of cold blue. Their muscular bodies, so impressive in warmer climates, became sluggish and unresponsive. One by one, they began falling into the torpor that preceded death for their species. Desperate students tried everything they could think of. Some attempted to dig shelters in the ice, but the frozen ground was harder than concrete, and their tools were designed for precision work, not heavy excavation. Others tried to huddle together for warmth, but their different biologies made this almost impossible. The Melkod's wet skin actually made the cold worse for anyone touching them. The Vextai were like touching blocks of ice. Within the first few hours after the technology failed, 3 students had already succumbed to hypothermia. Their bodies were found frozen solid, their faces locked in expressions of shock and disbelief. These were supposed to be the galaxy's elite students, beings whose species had conquered entire star systems. Yet they were dying like primitive creatures caught in a simple winter storm. While chaos reigned around him, Jake Morrison remained strangely calm. The electromagnetic readings he'd noticed during the approach had prepared him for this possibility. While other students had spent their time exploring and socializing, Jake had been gathering materials and thinking about much more basic problems. As his classmates watched in confusion and growing desperation, Jake began arranging his collection of seemingly useless debris into organized piles. Dead wood here, metal scraps there, dried organic matter in another pile. His movements were deliberate and confident, like someone following a plan that made perfect sense to him but looked like complete madness to everyone else watching. The human was building something, and whatever it was, He seemed to think it might actually save their lives. The night was getting colder by the minute, and Jake could hear the sounds of panic and desperation echoing across the frozen landscape. Students were crying out in their native languages, some calling for help that would never come, others making the terrible quiet sounds that meant hypothermia was taking hold. But Jake Morrison had work to do. He knelt down beside his pile of collected materials and pulled out 2 pieces of dry wood. One was a flat piece from the old mining equipment, and the other was a straight stick about the size of a pencil. Jake had learned this technique during summer camp when he was 12 years old, and his grandfather had taught him even older methods during their weekend trips to the mountains. Jake carved a small notch in the flat piece with his knife, then placed a stick in the groove. He began rolling the stick between his palms, pressing down and moving his hands back and forth rapidly. The friction generated heat, and tiny wood particles began collecting in the notch. After several minutes of steady work, a thin wisp of smoke appeared. The surviving alien students who could still move began gathering around him, watching with confusion and growing interest. Vorthak, the reptilian who had been so confident earlier, was now moving very slowly, his cold-blooded system barely functioning. "What is the primitive doing?" he asked through chattering teeth. Jake ignored the comments and carefully transferred his tiny ember to a nest of dry plant fibers he had prepared. He blew gently on the ember, feeding it oxygen until the fibers caught fire. Then he built up the fire gradually, adding small twigs first, then larger pieces of wood. Within 20 minutes, he had a genuine campfire burning brightly against the darkness. The reaction was immediate. Every surviving student began moving toward the fire, like moths drawn to a streetlight. The warmth was real, actual heat that their bodies could feel and use. Several of the Melkett students began crying with relief as circulation returned to their extremities. But Jake wasn't finished. While the others crowded around the fire, he began constructing a shelter using principles that were old when humans first left their caves. He took larger pieces of metal sheeting from the mining wreckage and created a windbreak on 3 sides of the fire. Then he gathered armfuls of any organic material he could find, dead grass, old cloth, even student uniforms from classmates who hadn't survived, and created thick layers of insulation. The key was understanding dead air space. Jake built his shelter so that there were multiple layers of material with air gaps between them. The trapped air acted as insulation, preventing heat loss while allowing the warmth from the fire to circulate. He created a small entrance that could be covered, turning the space into a primitive but effective survival shelter. Some of the alien students initially mocked his efforts. Zalara, one of the surviving Melkods, managed a weak laugh. "Look at the human playing with sticks and dirt. How can such basic methods help when our advanced biology has failed?" But as Jake's fire continued burning steadily and his shelter began radiating warmth, the mockery died away. The proof was undeniable. While alien advantages had failed against the simple reality of extreme cold, these ancient human techniques were actually working. The first student to swallow her pride was Nexia, one of the Vextai crystal beings. Her crystalline body was covered with cracks, and she was losing the ability to process information as the cold damaged her internal structure. She approached Jake hesitantly. "Human," she said, her voice sounding like breaking glass, "my matrix is failing. Your methods seem to generate genuine thermal energy. Will you teach me?" Jake nodded and began showing her the basics. First, he taught her about layering clothing and materials for insulation. He showed her how to recognize the early signs of hypothermia, confusion, shivering, loss of coordination, and what to do about them. Most importantly, he taught her simple exercises that would generate body heat through muscle movement. For Nexia's specific problem, Jake created a special warming station near the fire where she could safely absorb heat without getting too close to the flames. The gentle, steady warmth began stopping the progression of cracks through her crystalline form. Word spread quickly among the remaining survivors. Jake's primitive fire was the only source of warmth for miles around, and his shelter was the only place where the temperature stayed above freezing. One by one, even the most arrogant students began approaching him for help. Jake found himself teaching survival techniques that his own species had used for hundreds of thousands of years. He showed them how to maintain the fire through the night, taking turns feeding it fuel and keeping watch. He demonstrated how to melt snow safely for drinking water without losing precious body heat. He taught them to share body warmth effectively, even across different species with different biologies. The human was no longer the primitive outsider. He had become their teacher, their leader, and quite possibly their only hope for survival. By the second night, Jake's small fire had become the center of everything. The news of his success spread across the frozen wasteland in whispers carried by desperate students who crawled through the snow seeking help. What had started as one human with a pile of debris had transformed into something that defied everything the galactic academic world thought they knew about survival. Jake found himself surrounded by 16 surviving students from 6 different species, all looking to him for answers. These were beings whose civilizations had mastered faster-than-light travel, whose biology had been perfected over millions of years of evolution, whose technology could reshape entire planets. Yet here they sat around a simple wood fire built by a human, using techniques that were ancient when their species first looked up at the stars. The transformation in their attitudes was remarkable. Zalara, the Melkid who had laughed at his primitive methods, now hung on his every word as he explained how to properly melt snow for drinking water. The trick wasn't just heating it up. That wasted precious energy and could actually make dehydration worse. Jake showed them how to put snow in containers and place them near the fire, not directly over it. So the melting happened slowly and efficiently. Your body needs to conserve every calorie it burns, Jake explained to the group gathered around him. When you're fighting hypothermia, every bit of energy matters. If you drink ice-cold water, your body has to burn calories to warm it up inside you. But if you melt the snow properly and let it cool to just above freezing, you get hydration without losing precious heat. The concept of calorie management was completely foreign to most of them. Their species had evolved past the need to worry about energy conservation. Food was abundant on their worlds, climate control was universal, and their biologies were efficient enough that they rarely had to think about their body's energy budget. But Jake understood these principles at a level deeper than conscious thought. Building windbreaks became the next lesson. Jake organized work teams to gather materials and construct barriers that would deflect the worst of the wind. He taught them how air currents worked, how to identify where the wind was coming from, and how to position their shelters for maximum protection. The work kept them moving and generating body heat, while also improving their survival odds. The most dramatic inversion came from Corvus, a massive reptilian warrior who had been Jake's harshest critic from the beginning. Corvus belonged to a species that prided itself on physical strength and individual prowess. His people were conquerors who had dominated 3 star systems through superior military might. The idea that he might need help from a soft, weak human had been personally insulting. But on the second night, Corvus began showing signs of severe hypothermia. His reptilian metabolism was shutting down so completely that he couldn't even move. His body temperature had dropped so low that he was entering the deadly spiral, where hypothermia victims lose the ability to generate any heat at all. Jake immediately went to work. He organized the other students to help move Corvus closer to the fire, then began teaching them an advanced technique his grandfather had shown him during a winter survival course. They created a human warming system, with students taking turns lying next to Corvus and sharing their body heat, while others maintained the fire and prepared warm drinks. But the real breakthrough came when Jake began teaching Corvus specific exercises designed to generate heat in a failing metabolism. These weren't just random movements. They were targeted muscle contractions that could force circulation even when the body was trying to shut down. Jake had learned them from old military survival manuals, techniques developed for soldiers caught in winter warfare. Tense your core muscles and hold for 10 seconds, then release, Jake instructed, demonstrating the movements. Now flex your arms and legs, but keep the movement small so you don't waste energy. The goal is to force your blood to keep moving. The exercises worked. Slowly, carefully, Corvus began generating enough heat to stabilize his condition. The massive warrior, who had dismissed human intelligence as inferior, found himself completely dependent on Jake's knowledge for his very survival. From that moment on, Corvus became Jake's most dedicated student and protector. The reptilian warrior began learning every technique Jake shared, then teaching them to other struggling students. He organized work details, enforced Jake's instructions about fire maintenance, and made sure everyone understood that following the humans' guidance wasn't just smart. It was the only thing keeping them alive. The group developed a rhythm and discipline that would have impressed any military unit. They maintained continuous fire watches, with students taking shifts to feed fuel to flames and keep watch for dangers. They shared everything: food, warmth, even clothing when someone needed extra insulation. Jake had become more than their teacher. He was their leader, the one person who understood the fundamental truth that would keep them breathing until rescue came. On the morning of the third day, the electromagnetic storms finally began to weaken. Communication systems flickered back to life sporadically, sending fragmented signals up to the orbiting command ship. The rescue teams that had been helplessly waiting above Kilo's prime for 3 days immediately began preparing for the worst. Based on computer models and previous survival data, they expected to find maybe 8 or 9 survivors out of the 24 students who had been stranded on the surface. When the first rescue shuttle broke through the atmosphere and began scanning for life signs, the pilot couldn't believe his readings. The sensors were picking up a large group of survivors clustered together in one location, with clear signs of organized activity. Smoke was rising for what appeared to be multiple fire sources, and the thermal imaging showed structured shelters that definitely weren't natural formations. The shuttle touched down near Jake's camp to find an incredible sight. 18 students from 6 different species were not just alive, but organized and functioning as a cohesive group. They had established a complex of shelters connected by windbreaks, multiple fire stations for cooking and warmth, and even a basic medical area where the most injured students were being cared for by their classmates. Professor Keltar, the same insectoid being who had dismissed Jake's concerns about electromagnetic interference, stepped out of the rescue shuttle with his mouth hanging open in shock. The survival rate was unprecedented. In 50 years of running these exercises, they had never seen anything close to 75% of students surviving such extreme conditions without technological support. But what stunned the professor even more was the answer he got when he asked who was in charge. Every single survivor, regardless of species or previous attitude, pointed to Jake Morrison. The human who had been dismissed as primitive and unremarkable had somehow become the undisputed leader of the most successful survival group in Academy history. Medical teams immediately began treating students for frostbite, exposure, and various injuries related to their ordeal. The Vex-Tie students needed special treatment for their cracked crystalline matrices. Several Melcods required careful rebalancing of their blood chemistry. Even the hardy reptilian students showed signs of severe cold damage that would take weeks to fully heal. But remarkably, none of the injuries were life-threatening. Every single survivor was going to make a complete recovery. The medical teams were amazed by how well the students had managed their conditions and prevented the worst complications of severe hypothermia. As the rescued students recovered in the medical bay of the command ship, the full story began to emerge. Corva, still weak but determined to speak, told the professors how Jake had taught them to recognize the early signs of hypothermia and treat it before it became deadly. Nexia explained how human techniques had literally saved her crystalline matrix from complete structural failure. Zalara described learning to manage her amphibious biology using principles she had never imagined. Professor Keltar found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to admit he had been completely wrong about human capabilities. He approached Jake privately, his multiple arms fidgeting with embarrassment. "I must ask," the professor said, "how did you know techniques that prove superior to millions of years of evolutionary adaptation? Your species is barely spacefaring, yet your knowledge surpassed that of civilizations spanning multiple star systems." Jake's answer was simple but profound. He explained that humanity's evolutionary journey had been different from other species. While most galactic civilizations had developed in stable environments that allowed for biological specialization, humans had evolved on a world of constant change and challenge. Ice ages, climate shifts, natural disasters, and diverse environments had shaped humanity not to be perfectly adapted to any single condition, but to be adaptable to almost any condition. We didn't evolve the best night vision, or the strongest bodies, or the most efficient metabolism, Jake explained. Instead, we evolved the ability to figure things out, to learn from our mistakes, to remember what worked and pass that knowledge to the next generation. Every technique I used down there was developed by humans who faced similar challenges thousands of years ago. I didn't invent anything new. I just remembered what my ancestors learned. The implications of Jake's success rippled throughout the galactic academic community faster than news of a supernova. The Academy's databases were immediately updated to include human survival techniques as required study material for all students. Professors who had spent their careers focusing on biological advantages suddenly found themselves scrambling to understand concepts like accumulated cultural knowledge and adaptive problem solving. Jake returned to Earth as something approaching celebrity. The Galactic Academy offered him a full professorship and his own department focusing on primitive survival techniques. His former classmates became ambassadors for human methods throughout the galaxy, spreading respect for human ingenuity wherever their careers took them. But perhaps the most important lesson learned wasn't about survival techniques, or fire building, or shelter construction. The galaxy discovered that sometimes the most advanced solution to a problem isn't the one that requires the most sophisticated biology or the most complex technology. Sometimes the best answer is the one that comes from simple wisdom, passed down through generations of people who refused to give up when things got tough. The universe had learned that being human meant something more than anyone had realized.